Story number 1. The self-opening door. Winter in Boston can be both beautiful and unforgiving. The city transforms under a thick blanket of snow, its familiar streets becoming a labyrinth of white and shadow. For most, it's a season of holiday cheer and cozy nights by the fire. For me, it was a time of solitude and intense study. As a graduate student in literature, my life revolved around late-night readings, endless cups of coffee, and the silent companionship of my small, sparsely furnished apartment. I had moved into the apartment a year ago, drawn by its affordability and proximity to the university. The building itself was old, its brick facade weathered by countless winters, and its narrow hallways dimly lit by flickering sconces. My apartment was on the third floor, a compact space with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room dominated by a large window overlooking the quiet street below. That night in January 2018 was no different from the countless others I had spent alone, hunched over my desk with textbooks and notes scattered around me. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, turning the city into a ghostly expanse of swirling snowflakes and biting cold. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the house groan under the pressure of the storm. I was deep into a critical analysis of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart when I heard it, a sharp, metallic click followed by the distinct sound of a door handle turning. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was trying to enter. Panic surged through me as I glanced towards the front door, expecting to see a shadowy figure standing there. But the door remained firmly locked. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering between fear and curiosity. There was no response, only the relentless howl of the wind and the muffled sounds of the storm outside. I cautiously approached the door, each step measured and deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar? Or perhaps someone in need of help? As I reached for the handle, my hand froze mid-air. The door was locked, and yet, the footprints on the floor told a different story. Looking down, I saw a series of wet footprints leading from the door into the living room, their outlines clear against the dark hardwood floor. The prints were small, unmistakably those of a child, leading towards the far end of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I followed them with my eyes, noticing that they abruptly stopped near the old fireplace. There was no sign of anyone or anything continuing further into the room. Confusion and fear battled within me as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My apartment was empty. I was alone. The only other sounds were the crackling of the fire and the storm's rage outside. Shaking off the fear, I decided to investigate further. I walked towards the fireplace, the footprints leading me closer to the hearth. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the fire and the street lamps outside casting long shadows through the window. As I reached the fireplace, I noticed something odd and old. Tattered photograph propped up against the mantel. It was a family portrait, faded and yellowed with age, showing a man, a woman, and a young girl smiling warmly together. I picked up the photograph, examining it closely. The man in the photo looked strikingly familiar, his features resembling those of my late grandfather who had passed away several years earlier. My heart raced as memories flooded back. Grandfather's stories about the old house, the warmth of family gatherings, and the tragic fire that had claimed the lives of his wife and daughter, leaving him to live alone in the now empty home. A chill ran down my spine as realization dawned on me. The footprints, the photograph, the locked door, they were all pieces of a haunting puzzle. Could it be that the spirits of my grandparents were still lingering in the apartment, unable to find peace after the devastating loss? Determined to confront the inexplicable, I decided to perform a simple ritual of remembrance. I placed the photograph back on the mantel, lit a candle, and spoke softly into the silence. "Grandfather, I miss you both. Please, let me know if you're here." The room seemed to hold its breath, the only movement the dancing flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath visible in the cold air. The candle flickered violently, and the fire sputtered before burning out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I reached for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. As I shone it towards the fireplace, I saw her, my grandmother, dressed in a flowing white gown, standing just beyond the hearth. Her eyes were sad, filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through me. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heart. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I took a hesitant step forward, but the air around me grew thick, making it difficult to breathe. The room began to spin, the shadows dancing wildly as if alive. Suddenly, the front door burst open, the wind and snow rushing in, scattering papers and debris across the room. I shielded my face, feeling an overwhelming sense of fear and helplessness. When I looked back up, my grandmother was gone, the room returning to its former stillness. Shaken to my core, I collapsed onto the sofa, my mind racing with unanswered questions and lingering fear. I tried to rationalize what had happened, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew something beyond my understanding had occurred. The next day, I sought answers, delving into the history of the apartment and the tragic fire that had claimed my grandparents' lives. The local library held dusty records and old newspaper clippings that painted a grim picture of the past. The fire had been devastating, engulfing the house in flames that consumed everything in their path. My grandfather had survived, but at the cost of his beloved wife and daughter, leaving him to live out his days in a house filled with memories and sorrow. As I pieced together the fragments of history, I couldn't shake the feeling that their spirits were still tethered to the place, yearning for closure and peace. The footprints, the apparition, the haunting whispers, they were all signs of their lingering presence. Unable to move on from the tragedy that had defined their lives, determined to help, I decided to create a memorial for them, a place where their memories could be honored and their spirits could finally find rest. I gathered photographs, mementos, and personal items that held significance to them, arranging them carefully around the fireplace. I lit candles and placed flowers in honor of their memory, speaking words of love and remembrance into the silent room. That night, as I sat by the fire, the atmosphere felt different, calmer, more peaceful. I felt a presence, a gentle warmth that enveloped me, and a sense of serenity washed over the room. I closed my eyes, feeling a connection to my grandparents that transcended time and space. When I opened my eyes, the room was filled with a soft, ethereal glow. The footprints on the floor began to fade, disappearing one by one as if being lifted by an unseen force. The front door remained firmly shut, no longer a source of fear and uncertainty. I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that I had helped to ease their suffering and honor their memory. The haunting presence that had once filled the apartment with fear had been replaced by a sense of love and closure, allowing their spirits to finally find the rest they deserved. In the years that followed, the apartment became a place of warmth and comfort. The memory of my grandparents, now a cherished part of our home. The old rocking chair, once a source of fear, now served as a symbol of the enduring bonds of family and the power of remembrance. If you ever find yourself alone in a quiet place during the dead of winter, and you hear the faint sound of footsteps or see a figure standing by the window, remember my story. Sometimes, the spirits that linger are not there to haunt but to seek closure and connection. Honor their memories, offer your compassion, and you may just help them find the peace they have long been denied. Because in the stillness of the night, beneath the blanket of snow, the echoes of the past can reach out to touch the present, reminding us all that love and memory transcend even the darkest of tragedies. Story number 2. The moving chair. Winter in Maine is both a blessing and a curse. The serene blanket of snow transforms the landscape into a picturesque wonderland, yet it isolates the residents, cutting them off from the bustling life beyond their homesteads. I had always found solace in this isolation, embracing the quiet nights and the crisp, cold air that seemed to cleanse the soul. Our farmhouse, nestled on the edge of a dense pine forest, was my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the outside world was but a distant memory. It was December 1998, a particularly harsh winter that had already claimed its toll on the land. The snow piled high against the windows, and the wind howled relentlessly, rattling the old wooden shutters. I had spent most of the day tending to the house, ensuring that the fireplace was well stocked and the heating system was functioning optimally. The evenings were spent curled up on the sofa, a warm blanket draped over my legs, watching television to pass the time. That night, as I sank into the familiar comfort of my sofa, the crackling of the fire providing a soothing backdrop, something felt amiss. The house, usually so still, seemed to hold its breath. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of my unease. But everything appeared as it always did, orderly and undisturbed. I settled back, allowing myself to relax, when I noticed it, the rocking chair in the corner of the living room. It was an antique piece, a relic from the previous owners who had passed away years ago. The chair had always been a silent witness to my solitude, rarely used but always present. Tonight, however, it seemed to have a life of its own. At first, the movement was subtle, a gentle swaying that could have been mistaken for the house settling. But then, the swaying grew more pronounced, the chair rocking back and forth with increasing intensity. My heart quickened as I stared in disbelief. The chair continued to move, its creaking would breaking the stillness of the night. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from fatigue. But when I looked again, the chair was still moving. Panic began to set in as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I reached for the remote to turn off the TV, but my hand froze midair, unable to perform the simple action. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as if the very essence of the house was shifting. Desperate to regain control, I stood up and approached the rocking chair, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I neared, the movement ceased abruptly, leaving the chair still once more. I exhaled shakily, trying to steady my nerves, and glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal, no signs of intrusion, no disturbances other than the unnerving behavior of the chair. Determined to understand what was happening, I decided to investigate further. I turned off all the lights except for the fireplace, casting a warm glow that barely penetrated the darkness of the room. I approached the chair, my mind racing with questions. Why was it moving on its own? Was this a mere trick of the mind? Or was there something more sinister at play? As I reached out to touch the chair, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging the house into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the flashlight in the kitchen drawer, the beam cutting through the blackness. When the light steadied, I saw a figure standing behind the chair, a man dressed in old-fashioned attire, his face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. The figure remained silent, his presence exuding a sense of sorrow and longing. I took a step back, my mind struggling to comprehend the apparition before me. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee the room. But my feet were rooted to the spot, unable to move as the figure began to fade, his form dissipating into the darkness like mist in the morning sun. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of the encounter. Had I imagined it? Was it a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the oppressive winter cold? As I pondered these questions, a surge of determination overcame my fear. I needed answers, something to explain the inexplicable presence in my home. The following day, I sought out the local library, a quaint building that served as the repository of our small town's history. I delved into old records, searching for any mention of the previous owners and the history of the farmhouse. What I discovered was a tale of tragedy and loss that sent chills down my spine. The farmhouse had been owned by the Thompson family decades ago, a husband, wife, and their young son. The winter of 1975 had been brutal, with storms raging relentlessly and temperatures plummeting to dangerous lows. The Thompsons had struggled to keep the farmhouse warm, their spirits dampened by the unyielding cold. One night, a particularly fierce blizzard struck, and in the chaos, a fire broke out in the kitchen. The family perished in the flames, their lives extinguished in a desperate fight against the elements. Among the belongings left behind, the rocking chair stood out as a symbol of the family's final moments. It was said that the chair had been their family's favorite spot, a place of comfort and togetherness. The tragic end left an indelible mark on the house, with many locals believing that the spirits of the Thompsons lingered, unable to find peace. Armed with this knowledge, I returned home with a newfound understanding of the haunting presence. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, the memories of the Thompsons weighed heavily on my mind. I decided to honor their memory, believing that perhaps acknowledging their presence would help their spirits find the peace they deserved. I lit the fireplace and placed the talisman I had found in the attic, a small, intricately carved charm that the previous owners had left behind, near the hearth. I spoke softly, recounting their story, offering words of comfort and remembrance. The room felt warmer, the oppressive chill lifting as if the house itself was responding to my actions. As the night wore on, the rocking chair remained still, the atmosphere serene and calm. I felt a sense of fulfillment, believing that I had helped the lingering spirits find their rest. However, just as I was about to retire for the night, the chair began to move once more. This time, the movement was gentle, almost tender, as if acknowledging my efforts. I watched in awe as the figure of the man from the night before reappeared, his presence now less intimidating and more peaceful. He nodded slightly, a gesture of gratitude, before fading away completely. The room was quiet once more, the silence now filled with a sense of closure and tranquility. In the weeks that followed, the haunting ceased entirely. The farmhouse felt lighter, the air filled with a comforting warmth that had long been missing. Emily noticed the change, her writing more inspired and free from the shadows that had once clouded her creativity. We embraced the history of our home, honoring the Thompsons' legacy by preserving their memory and sharing their story with others. Years later, the farmhouse remains our haven, a place where the echoes of the past coexist harmoniously with the present. The rocking chair stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of remembrance. The talisman, now framed on the mantel, serves as a constant reminder of the night when I helped a lost family find their way to peace. If you ever find yourself alone in a secluded place during the dead of winter, and you feel a presence watching over you, remember my story. Sometimes, the spirits that linger are not there to haunt but to seek acknowledgement and closure. Respect their stories, honor their memories, and you may just help them find the peace they so desperately seek. Because in the quiet stillness of a winter night, the past can reach out to guide you, reminding us all that some souls are forever intertwined with the places they once called home. Story number 3. Whispers from the Hearth. Winter in Montana is a time of relentless beauty and bone-chilling isolation. The vast expanses of snow-covered plains and dense forests create a landscape both serene and unforgiving. My wife, Emily, and I had chosen to leave the chaos of city life behind, seeking solace in our secluded farmhouse nestled at the edge of the wilderness. It was the perfect retreat, or so we thought. I worked as a wildlife photographer, spending most of my days capturing the elusive beauty of Montana's fauna. Emily, a freelance writer, reveled in the quiet, finding inspiration in the solitude that our home provided. The farmhouse was a sturdy, old structure with a large stone fireplace that became the heart of our home during the long winter months. The evenings were spent by the fire, sharing stories, sipping hot cocoa, and enjoying the peacefulness that surrounded us. It was early December, and the first heavy snowfall had blanketed the land, turning our world into a pristine winter wonderland. One evening, As I was preparing for a late-night shoot, Emily sat by the fireplace, typing away on her laptop. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old house groan under the weight of the snow. I glanced up from my gear, noticing a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting aside my camera. She nodded, though her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Just the usual deadlines getting to me. Nothing out of the ordinary." I smiled reassuringly and returned to my preparations, but a nagging feeling of discomfort settled in my stomach. The isolation, usually a source of comfort, began to feel oppressive, as if the walls of our home were closing in. That night, as the clock struck 3 a.m., the wind had died down to a mere whisper, and the farmhouse was enveloped in an eerie silence. I woke to the faint sound of whispering, barely audible over the soft crackle of the fire. At first, I dismissed it as the wind finding new paths through the old house. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. I sat up, the chill of the night air creeping through the thin curtains. "Emily?" I called softly, but there was no response. The house was empty, and Emily was asleep in the bedroom. I reached for my phone, intending to check the time or maybe make a quick call. But the device was dead, completely unresponsive. Confusion and fear began to take hold as the whispers persisted, weaving through the rooms like a ghostly presence. I followed the sound, which seemed to emanate from the direction of the fireplace. As I approached, the whispers intensified, forming indistinct words that sent shivers down my spine. Steeling myself, I glanced into the hearth, expecting to see embers or shadows dancing on the walls. Instead, I saw a faint, shimmering image, a figure dressed in traditional Native American attire, standing just beyond the firelight. Her eyes met mine, filled with sorrow and longing. Before she began to move toward me, I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure remained silent, her presence growing more intense. Suddenly, she vanished, leaving behind a lingering chill and a sense of profound sadness. I stood there, shaken, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Had I really imagined it? Or was there something supernatural at play? The following morning, the storm had subsided, leaving the landscape untouched and serene. Determined to find answers, I decided to research the history of our farmhouse. I spent hours poring over old records and speaking with local historians, uncovering a tragic story that sent chills down my spine. Decades ago, the farmhouse had been the site of a brutal murder-suicide. A young Native American woman named Ayanna had lived there with her family, struggling to preserve her heritage in the face of modern encroachment. Tensions had risen, culminating in a violent confrontation during a particularly harsh winter. Ayanna had taken her own life, leaving behind a legacy of pain and unresolved sorrow. As I delved deeper, I discovered that the family had been deeply spiritual, believing in the presence of ancestral spirits that protected their home. The talisman I later found in the chimney was an old protective charm, a symbol of their faith and a barrier against malevolent forces. That night, armed with the knowledge of Ayanna's tragic past, I decided to confront the lingering presence. I descended into the basement, where I found the old chimney. The snow had begun to melt slightly, creating a damp, musty smell that filled the air. I pulled aside some debris, revealing a small, weathered box adorned with intricate carvings. Inside the box lay the talisman, a beautiful piece made of carved wood and beads, glowing faintly in the dim light. As I held it, the whispers returned, softer this time, filled with a sense of hope rather than sorrow. I placed the talisman back in the box and closed it gently. "Ayanna," I whispered, "I know your story. I'm sorry for what happened." A moment of silence followed, and then the whispers ceased, replaced by a profound stillness that settled over the house. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the oppressive feeling of the past finally easing. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse felt different. The air was lighter, and the whispers were gone. Emily noticed the change. Her writing more inspired and free from the shadows that had once clouded her creativity. We began to embrace the history of the house, honoring Ayana's memory by preserving her legacy and sharing her story with others. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames enveloping us, Emily reached into the box and held the talisman. "It's like a bridge," she mused, "a way to connect with those who came before us, to honor their lives and their stories." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. Maybe that's what was missing all along: understanding and respect for the past. Years have passed since that chilling night, and the farmhouse remains our sanctuary, a place where the echoes of the past coexist with the present in harmony. The talisman serves as a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between our world and the spirits that linger, seeking understanding and peace. If you ever find yourself alone in a secluded place during a harsh winter night, and you hear whispers that seem to call your name, remember my story. Sometimes, the spirits that dwell in the shadows are not there to haunt but to share their stories, to seek closure, and to remind us of the enduring power of memory and respect. Respect the histories of the places you inhabit. Honor the souls who have passed. And perhaps, like us, you will find peace amidst the whispers of the past. Story number 4. The Woman in White. Winter in rural Vermont is a time of stark beauty and bone-chilling isolation. The snow blankets everything in sight, muting the world into a hushed stillness that feels almost sacred. I've lived alone in our farmhouse for the past 5 years, finding solace in the simplicity and solitude it offers. The only sounds that break the silence are the howling wind and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling under the weight of the snow. It was December 2015, a particularly harsh winter that seemed intent on testing my endurance. The days were short, the nights long and unforgivingly cold. I spent most of my time tending to the land, maintaining the house, and keeping the fire burning to fend off the biting chill. Life was predictable, monotonous even, but it suited me just fine. That is, until one fateful night when the isolation became more than just a comfort. It became a conduit for something far more sinister. I was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping hot tea by the fireplace. The fire crackled and danced, casting long shadows that flickered across the walls. The wind outside was particularly fierce that night, howling through the gaps in the windows and rattling the panes with a relentless fury. I was lost in thought, contemplating the tranquility of my life, when I first noticed her, a silhouette standing just beyond the glass of the front window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying trees. But as I watched, the figure became more distinct. She was a woman, dressed entirely in white, her posture rigid as she stared intently into the room. Her presence was unnerving, a stark contrast against the bleak, snowy landscape. I felt a chill run down my spine, my instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond, her gaze never wavering. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear that settled deep within my bones. Mustering my courage, I rose from my seat and approached the window, my breath visible in the frigid air. As I peered outside, the woman was gone. No sign of her remained, only the pristine snow undisturbed by any footprints or disturbances. Confused and unsettled, I turned back to the room, only to notice something even more disturbing: the faint imprint of small footprints leading from the window and disappearing into the thickening snow. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the eerie image, but the footprints persisted, etched clearly into the fresh snow. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize the situation. Could it have been a child playing in the snow, leaving behind tiny tracks that vanished as quickly as they appeared? Or was there something more malevolent at play? Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to investigate further. Bundling up in my warmest coat, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, the storm making visibility nearly impossible. The snow whipped around me, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing. But I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. I followed the footprints, my flashlight beam darting across the snowy terrain, illuminating nothing but the endless expanse of white. The tracks led me deeper into the woods, where the trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. But I couldn't turn back now. After what felt like hours, the footprints abruptly stopped at the edge of a frozen pond. The surface was smooth, untouched by any movement, reflecting the pale light of the moon that struggled to break through the storm clouds. There was no sign of the woman or any other footprints, just the eerie stillness of the pond. Panic began to set in as I realized I was alone, the only evidence of her existence being the footprints that led me to this desolate spot. I turned to head back, but the path had vanished, swallowed by the relentless snowfall. The storm showed no mercy, the world around me a blur of white and shadow, making it impossible to navigate back to the farmhouse. Desperate and disoriented, I stumbled through the snow, the biting cold numbing my fingers and face. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to dance around me, taunting me with their elusive presence. The howling wind turned into whispers, indistinct murmurs that echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. Just as hope began to fade, I saw a faint light through the trees, a dim glow that seemed out of place in the midst of the storm. With the last of my strength, I made my way toward it, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The light led me to an old, abandoned cabin, its windows dark and the door hanging loosely on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years, yet the light suggested someone was inside. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the interior shrouded in darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the remnants of a once cozy space, dusty furniture, a fireplace long extinguished, and an old mirror hanging on the wall. My gaze was drawn to it, the glass reflecting the dim light in a way that made the room feel both familiar and foreign. Suddenly, I heard a soft, sorrowful whisper coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight revealing nothing but the empty room. Fear gripped me as I turned back to the mirror, expecting to see someone there, but the reflection was empty, just my own weary face staring back at me. Then, without warning, the mirror began to fog over, and the image of the woman in white reappeared, her hollow eyes staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, the realization dawning on me that she was not just a figment of my imagination. Her presence was real, a lingering spirit bound to this forsaken place. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. The woman remained silent, her gaze never wavering. I took a step forward, trying to bridge the distance between us. But the mirror seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unspoken sorrow. The whispers returned, now clearer, a haunting lament that filled the room. "I can't leave," the voice echoed, a desperate plea that sent chills down my spine. "Help me." Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached out, my hand trembling as it touched the glass. The reflection rippled, and I saw flashes of a tragic past, images of a life cut short by a violent storm, the family torn apart, and the woman alone, searching for peace that eluded her. I realized then that this was the same house where a gruesome accident had occurred years ago, a young woman who had lost her life in the cold embrace of winter, her spirit forever wandering the halls of her shattered home. The footprints, the apparitions, the whispers, they were all remnants of her anguish, trapped in an eternal loop of sorrow. Determined to help, I vowed to find a way to free her spirit, to bring closure to her restless soul. I spent the following days researching local history, uncovering the tragic story of Eleanor Hart, the woman who had been the victim of a deadly accident on that very stretch of highway. Her untimely death had left an indelible mark on the land, her presence a haunting reminder of the fragility of life. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the cabin, determined to perform a ritual of remembrance and release. I gathered candles, old photographs, and personal mementos that Eleanor might have cherished, setting them carefully around the room. As I lit the candles, the air grew warmer, the oppressive chill lifting as the flames flickered softly. I stood before the mirror once more, Eleanor's figure now more defined, her sorrowful eyes filled with a yearning for peace. I began to speak, recounting her story, honoring her memory, and expressing my desire to help her find the peace she so desperately sought. The room filled with a gentle warmth, the whispers transforming into a soothing melody that resonated with hope. Eleanor's reflection began to smile, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now gentle and free of pain. "I can finally rest." As the last of the candles burned down, Eleanor's apparition faded into the light, her presence no longer a shadow of sorrow but a beacon of peace. The mirror reflected only my own weary face. The weight of the past lifted as I felt a sense of fulfillment wash over me. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a serene blanket of snow that seemed to cleanse the land of its dark secrets. The farmhouse felt lighter, the air filled with a newfound sense of calm. I knew that Eleanor had found her peace, her spirit finally free from the chains of her tragic past. In the years that followed, I never forgot that night. The story of Eleanor Hart became a whispered legend among the locals, a tale of love, loss, and the enduring power of remembrance. The farmhouse remained my sanctuary, a place where the echoes of the past no longer haunted the present but served as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. If you ever find yourself alone in a secluded place during the dead of winter, and you hear the soft echo of footsteps or see a figure standing by the window, remember my story. Sometimes, the spirits that wander the silent snows are not there to haunt but to seek closure, their presence a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, hope and peace can prevail. Story number 5. Footsteps in the attic. Winter in Vermont is a relentless force, transforming even the most familiar landscapes into a desolate expanse of white silence. In January 2005, I found myself alone in our old farmhouse, nestled deep within the woods where the snow piled high against the windows and the wind howled through the barren trees. My husband had traveled to visit family, leaving me to manage the house and our aging dogs. The isolation was something I had grown accustomed to, a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of everyday life. That night, the storm was particularly fierce. The snow fell in heavy, unyielding sheets, and the temperature plummeted well below freezing. I sat by the fireplace, a book in hand, trying to lose myself in the pages to ward off the creeping chill. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm, each gust of wind sending shadows dancing across the walls. Around 2 a.m., a sudden noise shattered the calm. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps softly echoing through the attic. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced up, trying to reassure myself that it was just the house settling or perhaps the wind playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I was certain I was alone. I set the book aside and listened intently. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder, more deliberate. It was unmistakably footsteps, moving with purpose. My mind raced, contemplating the possibilities. Maybe one of the neighbors needed help, though the nearest house was miles away. Or perhaps it was just a stray animal making its way through the roof. I dismissed the thoughts, convincing myself it was nothing more than my imagination fueled by the storm. Unable to shake the unease, I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way up the creaky wooden stairs to the attic. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound amplified in the stillness of the night. As I reached the top, the flashlight beam pierced the darkness, revealing the cluttered space filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten memories. The tapping had stopped. I scanned the room, the beam of light darting from corner to corner, but found nothing out of the ordinary, just empty spaces and shadows. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me. Perhaps it was just the wind, or the house settling after a long day. As I turned to descend the stairs, a sudden chill enveloped the attic, and the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, the flashlight flickering. The room was still empty, but the air felt thick with an unseen presence. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, locked tight. Panic began to set in as I backed away, the realization that I was trapped sinking in. The temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the icy air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadowy figure standing near the far wall, its form indistinct yet undeniably human. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No response. The figure remained silent, his presence oppressive and malevolent. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was dead, no signal in the remote farmhouse. Desperation clawed at me as the figure began to move towards me, each step deliberate and unnerving. I backed away, my mind racing for an escape, but the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the figure advanced. The tapping from earlier echoed in my mind, now amplified by the fear coursing through my veins. Just as the figure was about to reach me, a blinding flash of light erupted from the corner of the room, momentarily disorienting both of us. The figure recoiled, disappearing into the shadows as suddenly as it had appeared. The door swung open, the oppressive atmosphere lifting instantly. I didn't hesitate, racing down the stairs and out into the stormy night, the howling wind seeming to mock my terror. I didn't stop running until I reached the warmth of the kitchen, huddling by the fireplace once more, trembling uncontrollably. The storm continued unabated outside, the house now silent except for the crackling of the fire and my own ragged breaths. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was all a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind amplified by fear and isolation. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a serene blanket of snow that seemed to erase the horrors of the night before. Shaken but determined to find answers, I decided to explore the attic again, hoping to uncover some logical explanation for the night's events. As I ascended the stairs, the memory of the figure lingered, a nagging doubt that there was more to the story. This time, the attic was still and quiet, the remnants of the previous night's terror seemingly vanished. I scanned the room once more, the flashlight beam revealing nothing unusual. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a series of small footprints leading from the attic window, down the snowy slope into the surrounding woods. The prints were faint but unmistakable, evidence that someone or something had been there. Confusion and fear mingled within me as I followed the trail outside, the cold biting at my skin. The footprints led deep into the forest, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. I trailed the path as far as I could, the snow crunching under my boots, until the footprints abruptly stopped at the edge of a frozen pond. There was no sign of anyone else, no disturbances in the snow, no sounds except the distant call of a lone owl. I stood there, the weight of the night's events pressing down on me, trying to make sense of it all. Had someone been watching me? Was there a neighbor in need, as I had hoped? Or was this something far more sinister? The unanswered questions haunted me, a persistent shadow that refused to fade. Determined to uncover the truth, I reached out to the local authorities, recounting the terrifying experience and showing them the footprints. The police listened with a mixture of skepticism and concern, promising to investigate further. Days turned into weeks, and no definitive answers emerged. The farmhouse remained quiet, the memory of that night lingering like a ghostly presence. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace once more, a sense of calm began to settle over me. The fear that had once consumed me was replaced by a fragile peace, a belief that whatever had occurred was perhaps a one-time occurrence, a fleeting glimpse into the unknown. But deep down, I knew that some mysteries are never fully unraveled, their shadows forever cast upon the lives they touch. The farmhouse still stands in the snowy Vermont woods, a silent witness to the night when footsteps echoed through the attic and the past reached out to claim a fragment of my present. If you ever find yourself alone in a remote place, and you hear footsteps where no one should be, remember my story. Sometimes, the echoes of the past are too powerful to be ignored, lingering in the silence and waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. Story number 6. Reflections of the past. Winter in Alaska is a relentless force, shaping both the landscape and the soul. The months stretch endlessly, each day blending into the next under a thick blanket of snow and ice. My life as a freelance photographer often takes me to these remote regions, capturing the stark beauty that few dare to witness. But in the winter of 2011, a trip to an isolated cabin deep within the Brooks Range would reveal that some places hold shadows far darker than the endless night. I had rented an old, secluded cabin off the beaten path, far from the nearest town. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my work, away from the distractions of city life. The cabin was modest, built from weathered timber that had withstood countless storms. Inside, it was cozy but stark, with a large mirror hanging on the living room wall, a full-length, antique piece that seemed out of place amidst the modern furnishings. The first few days passed peacefully. I spent my time photographing the breathtaking vistas, the snow-covered peaks glistening under the weak winter sun. The nights were quiet, the only sounds being the howling wind and the occasional crack of ice shifting outside. I found solace in the solitude, my thoughts as clear as the crisp winter air. One particularly frigid night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange sensation. The silence of the cabin was broken by a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an inexplicable heaviness that settled over me. I sat up in bed, the chill seeping through the blankets, and glanced toward the living room. The full-length mirror caught my eye, reflecting the dim light of a single lamp. As I stared into the mirror, a fleeting image caught my attention. A man standing directly behind me. His presence was unsettling, a cold chill running down my spine as I turned swiftly to confront him. But the room was empty. There was no one there, only the shadows dancing on the walls cast by the flickering lamp. I returned my gaze to the mirror, expecting to see nothing more than my own reflection. To my horror, the man remained, his eyes hollow and his expression void of emotion. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but the figure was still there, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the beating of my heart. No response came, just the oppressive silence of the cabin. I backed away slowly, the man's reflection unwavering in the glass. Days turned into weeks, and the apparition became a recurring nightmare. Every night, without fail, the man would appear in the mirror, standing just out of reach, his presence a constant reminder of the cabin's dark history. Sleep became elusive, and my work suffered as fear gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into the cabin's past. The nearest town was small, with residents who were tight-lipped about the remote cabin. After persistent inquiries, I learned of a tragic incident that had occurred years before. In the winter of 2005, a man named Thomas Grayson had lived in that very cabin. An artist by profession, Thomas had struggled with personal demons, his life spiraling into despair. One stormy night, unable to bear the isolation any longer, Thomas had taken his own life. The details were murky, with conflicting accounts from neighbors who rarely ventured near the cabin. Some believed Thomas had been tormented by unseen forces, while others thought it was a desperate act of a man pushed to the brink. Regardless of the cause, his death left a lingering presence in the cabin, a shadow that refused to fade. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront the apparition. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled and the snow swirled violently outside, I sat alone in the living room, the mirror before me like a dark portal to the past. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and addressed the reflection directly. "Thomas, I know what happened here. I'm not going to leave you alone." The air grew colder, my breath visible in the frigid room. The figure in the mirror seemed to sense my intention, his form becoming more defined, his eyes meeting mine with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "Why are you still here?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. He remained silent for a moment, the tension thick in the room. Then, in a voice that echoed from the depths of the past, he spoke. "I can't move on. I need help." Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached out, my fingers trembling. "How can I help you?" The reflection moved closer, his hand reaching out as if trying to bridge the gap between us. "Find peace for me. Remember my story." Determined to bring closure, I spent the next few days researching Thomas Grayson's life. I discovered that he had been a reclusive artist, his work admired but never fully understood. His paintings were haunting, filled with abstract forms and dark colors that seemed to pulsate with emotion. It became clear that Thomas had been battling inner demons, his art a reflection of his tormented soul. I decided to honor his memory by creating an exhibition of his work, aiming to give him the recognition he deserved and perhaps offer him the peace he sought. I reached out to art galleries and collectors, piecing together the fragments of his artistic legacy. As the exhibition took shape, the presence in the cabin began to change. The nightly apparitions became less frequent, their sorrow replaced by a sense of gratitude. On the night before the exhibition's opening, I returned to the cabin one last time. The mirror stood before me, no longer a window to a haunted past, but a testament to the healing power of remembrance. I stood before it, feeling the weight of Thomas's presence lifted, replaced by a serene stillness. "Thank you, Thomas," I whispered, a sense of closure washing over me. "Your story will be told." The mirror reflected only my own image now. The man who had once been a restless spirit, now a celebrated artist whose legacy would live on. The cabin, once a place of sorrow, now stood as a monument to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of art. Years later, the exhibition was a resounding success, drawing attention to Thomas Grayson's work and his tragic story. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many moved by the depth and emotion captured in his paintings. Visitors often remarked on the haunting beauty of his art, unaware of the spectral presence that had once haunted the cabin. As for me, the experience left an indelible mark on my soul. I continued my work as a photographer, but the story of Thomas Grayson remained a poignant reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead, and the importance of remembering those who have been forgotten. If you ever find yourself alone in a secluded place during a harsh winter night, and you catch a glimpse of a sorrowful reflection in a mirror, remember my story. Sometimes, the past reaches out not to haunt, but to be remembered, to find peace through the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Story number 7. Midnight Knock. Winter in rural Canada is a silent, unforgiving season. The vast expanse of snow-covered fields and dense forests creates a landscape both beautiful and isolating. In January 2010, I found myself alone in our family farmhouse, nestled deep within these frozen woods. My parents had left for the city a week earlier, leaving me to manage the house while they dealt with an emergency. The nights were the hardest. The cold seeped through every crevice, and the howling wind made the house groan under its weight. I was used to the solitude, but as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, a sense of unease began to settle over me. It was the first night of a particularly brutal snowstorm. The wind was relentless, battering the windows and rattling the shutters. I sat by the fireplace, trying to distract myself with a book, but my mind kept wandering to the stories my grandmother used to tell about spirits that roamed these woods during the long winter nights. Around 3 a.m., as the clock ticked past midnight, I was abruptly awakened by a sharp, persistent knocking at the front door. My heart raced as I listened intently. The knocking continued, each beat echoing through the silent house. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether to ignore it or investigate. Memories of my grandmother's tales surged back, filling me with both fear and curiosity. Gathering my courage, I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and tiptoed towards the door. The snow outside was swirling violently, making it difficult to see anything beyond a few feet. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see a stranded traveler or someone seeking help. Instead, all I saw was darkness, the storm obscuring any sign of life. Confused and unnerved, I opened the door slightly, just enough to peer outside. The snowflakes danced in the air, and the only sound was the relentless wind. There was no one in sight. My heart pounded as I shut the door, the cold rush of air making me shiver uncontrollably. As I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something odd in the fresh snow outside, the unmistakable imprint of footsteps leading directly to our front door. The prints were small, delicate, as if made by a child, and they stopped abruptly at the threshold of our home. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of where the person had gone. I stared at the footprints, my mind racing with questions. Who could it be? Why would they stop right at the door? The storm made it impossible for anyone to have traveled far from their source. Yet no one had approached us before the knocking began. Determined to find some explanation, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The footprints were still there, leading into the depths of the nearby forest. The trees loomed ominously, their branches heavy with snow, casting long, eerie shadows under the dim light of the moon. Taking a deep breath, I followed the trail, my footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. The forest was silent, the only sound being the crunch of my boots and the distant howl of the wind. The footprints led deeper into the woods, and as I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My mind played tricks on me, conjuring images of ghostly figures lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, the trail ended at a small clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging ajar. The knocking had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I approached the cabin cautiously, the flashlight beam wavering in my trembling hand. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, filled with the remnants of a life long forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. As I explored the space, my flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced eerily on the walls. In the corner, I found a dusty old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, curiosity getting the better of me. I opened the journal and began to read. It belonged to a young woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the cabin decades ago. Her entries spoke of loneliness, the harshness of winter, and a growing sense of being watched. The final entry was incomplete. The ink smeared and faded, but it hinted at a tragic accident, a car crash that had claimed her life and left her spirit restless. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the connection. Could Eleanor be the one who had been knocking at my door? The thought sent a shiver through me, but I couldn't turn back now. Determined to put Eleanor's spirit to rest, I decided to perform a small ritual mentioned in one of her entries, lighting a candle and offering a prayer for her peace. I gathered the necessary items and returned to the cabin. As I lit the candle, the flame flickered violently, casting ghostly shadows around the room. I began to speak softly, reciting the prayer from Eleanor's journal. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the icy air, and the candle's light seemed to dim. Suddenly, the room was filled with a soft, sorrowful whispering, the sound of Eleanor's voice. Lost in grief, her apparition materialized before me, a translucent figure in a tattered dress. Her eyes hollow and filled with pain, she reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, and whispered, "Thank you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I continued the prayer, my voice barely audible over the haunting whispers. The room grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting as Eleanor's spirit found the peace it had long been denied. Her apparition smiled faintly before fading into the ether, the cabin returning to its silent state. I left the cabin with a sense of relief, the storm outside beginning to calm. As I walked back through the snow-covered forest, the footprints leading away from the cabin had vanished, leaving no trace of Eleanor's presence. I returned to the farmhouse, the first light of dawn breaking through the storm clouds, casting a warm glow over the snowy landscape. That night, I never felt alone again. The memory of Eleanor's sorrowful gaze and the persistent knocking had been laid to rest, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The storm had brought more than just snow. It had brought a spirit in need of compassion and closure. In the years that followed, I often thought back to that chilling night, sharing my story with friends and family who dismissed it as a mere ghost story. But I knew the truth. I had encountered a restless spirit, seeking solace in the depths of a winter storm, and in helping her find peace. I had found a deeper understanding of the mysteries that lie hidden in the silent snows of rural Canada. If you ever find yourself alone in a remote area during a harsh winter night, and you hear a persistent knocking at your door, remember my story. Sometimes, the spirits that wander these frozen landscapes are not there to haunt you, but to seek the peace they can no longer find on their own. Approach with kindness, and you may just help a lost soul find their way home.